people?
An awful lot were Irish immigrants who'd come over, certainly in the 18th century and also in the 19th century, particularly the help of the potato famines of the 1840s. The Irish immigrants really settled around Wapping.
Somehow, there would have been lots of stealing going on from around the docks, and there are small gangs and families who did those sort of things. Eventually, they all sort of came together, didn't they?
Yes, certainly the most powerful collection were the Watt disputers, and they were the people who controlled the docks, who got work on them, who could get a ticket later on to work regularly, who was picked for casual labour, and so on. And they were, to a large extent, they were fighting gangs.
So how did they make their money?
Well, of course, they paid a wage for a start, but there was, as with any docks, if you have a dock, you've got enormous opportunities for theft. The people who controlled the union could also decide who worked there. And so consequently, if you wanted to work on the dock, you had to pay money to the people running the docks.
So what about if other gangs stole things?
If other people stole things, then really it's the same as the Crays down the East End later. The Watt disputers would expect to tax them. Perhaps if the property came to, I don't know, say £20, they'd want a fine and that sort of thing.
During 1919, 1,500 people were arrested for cargo poaching. The shipping police was formed to oversee cargoes being loaded and unloaded, but the stealing went on. Thieving from ships was almost customary. The theft of rum was prevalent. One method, known as sucking the monkey, was where they would siphon off the alcohol from the barrel using a hose. A second technique, called spiking the cask, involved simply drilling holes in the keg. And having extra long pockets sewn inside their trousers was a neat way of hiding any stolen goods from the day. During the First World War, pilfering was organised by the older dockers. They hired lads to do their dirty work. The boys could earn £4 a week when a normal wage was only 12 shillings. To the streeters, it was more money for old rope. While the Irish immigrants settled down by the docks, 100 years later, a new wave of Asian immigrants were arriving in London. This is south of West London. In the 1950s, Indian and Pakistani immigrants came here to find jobs in the factories and at the airport. Now, 85% of the residents here are Asian. The influx of Asians gave rise to the likes of the Teddy Boys and a much more powerful groups like the National Front. The Asians had to defend themselves, so they formed gangs. Now, one of these gangs was called the Tooting Nung. I'm meeting up with a man who's done a lot of research into this, journalist and crime writer, Tony Thompson. First of all, tell me about, when did gangs first emerge in this area?
Well, around the Suffolk area, they really started around the late 60s, early 70s, which was around the same time that we started to get a large population of people from the Indian subcontinent coming to this part of London and setting up shop here. In the early days when they were being here, there was a lot of racism, a lot of people being attacked by sort of people like the National Front and so on. And they started to defend themselves by gathering together in vigilante gangs to defend themselves against the racists. But what happened was once the threat from the racists started to fade a little bit, those gangs stayed around, started attacking each other, and started preying on the local community themselves. What happened a lot of the time was that they would go to shop owners and local businesses and demand protection money, saying that they would help them to prevent being attacked by racists and so on, and guard their properties.
Yeah.
And once
So they were attacking their own community, really?
yeah, I mean, they started off defending them, but then they went into attacking them once the actual problem disappeared, because they still wanted to be around. And they thought, well, we must make some money out of this, and slowly moved into organised crime. It's actually exactly what happened as well. They started with vigilantes. Once the threat had gone, ended up becoming organised crime.
Initially, the gang was known as the Holy Smokes, but caste divisions within it created a rift. So the Holy Smokes in the 70s, they were a big gang, a big Asian gang, and they split at one point, didn't they?
Yeah, what happened is that the whole Indian community has a big problem with caste. If you're the wrong caste, you can't sort of associate with people of a different caste. And within the holy smokes, they had several different castes, and some of the people in the lower caste felt they weren't being treated properly by those in the higher caste, so they ended up going off and forming their own gang, which they called the Tutti Nuns.
They saw themselves as being from the lowest caste. Tutti Nun means the worthless ones. Where there had been unity, there was now bitterness and rivalry between the Tutti Nun and the Holy Smokes. To find out about the consequences of this rift, I'm going along to see Dr. Avatar Lit, founder of Sunrise Radio, which has been here in Southall since the 80s.
The radio station is kind of part of, it's really a centre of the community, right? So when was the first time you heard about the Tutti Nun and the Holy Smokes?
Well, we used to run a radio station from the marketplace, which is around, in the sort of early 80s, right from the heart of the town. And we used to play dedications and songs to Tutti Nuns and Holy Smokes. Young girls to call up to say, this is this next song for so-and-so. We didn't know who they were. I came from outside Southall, and it was just a normal broadcast. It's like a daughter sending a dedication to an auntie or something. And it's only later on we found out that Tutti Nuns and Holy Smokes were really local sort of mini gangsters, so to speak. The Holy Smokes, for example, they were made of youngsters. And one would like to think that the pillars of the community give guidance and discipline, but in this particular case, they actually fostered those gangs.
Unlike most outfits that grow from the street upwards, this gang was formed and nurtured by the elders from the top down.
The local community actually had a legitimate way of making money. There were community organizations at the time. Control of those community organizations became very important.
Yeah.
And this is how gang culture was actually encouraged by the members of the community, all the members of the community, the pillars of society, the kind of people who sit at the local superintendent's office to sort out the community problems.
So it was ingrained quite deep.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was actually encouraged by the community elders. They did it not because they want lawlessness in the community or in the country or in the town. They did it because that was their muscle, effectively, yes, in order to control an organization. But you see, basically, this is not something new to the Asian culture. I mean, if you look at the Indian cities of Bombay and all the rest of it, it is almost customary that a shopkeeper would actually pay a local gang protection money on a weekly basis. It happens today, and you can't even escape from it. Most members of the public didn't know anything about it, but I think in the early 80s, it's people starting to fear if somebody would say, well, I'm this one's gang member, so and so. People will shy away from challenging that person.
So if you were a kid, would you choose to be either one or the other, or were you born into it almost?
I think they were actively recruiting people from schools and other things, and I think that it was almost fashionable to be part of one or the other.
It only hit home to Avatar how threatening the gangs were when he realised their influence extended into his own news team. With the journalists so intimidated, they felt unable to even mention the gangs in their reporting.
There was one. Was to be head of gang who was sent to prison, and he was he went inside, and my news team actually refused to carry the story because the news team they're all very famous journalists now, but 20 years ago they were beginners. They were to work with newspapers, they came to work with the local radio station, and I threatened to sack the entire news team simply because they'd gone to local schools. They knew how the setup was far more than I did. They said they weren't prepared to carry the news, although the man had been convicted, sent to prison. And they said they value their face not more than actually their jobs.
Yeah. So they were really controlling the community with fear.
Yes. Yes, it was. I think the fear. I think they probably did a lot less, but the fear was far greater.
But By the 1980s, the fighting between the two gangs became so violent and so public that everyone in Southall became aware of a serious gang problem. I want to know why it got so out of control.
Despite the fact that they started off together within the same gang, once they split, they became mortal enemies. I think in some ways it gave them something to do by attacking one another. They'd be vicious battles. I mean, sort of like nothing that had ever been seen in the area before. But they'd be involving machetes and hammers and screwdrivers and all sorts of knives, and people would be often very badly hurt. But these would seem as a great source of pride for the gangs as to who would come off better. It's a bit like sort of the worst kind of football hooliganism, these two mass gangs coming together in public and just brawling together. And it would happen on a regular basis.
Did they have to kill each other? Or?
I think the idea was never specifically to kill, it was always just to sort of win the fight. But some people did die occasionally. It was more about people getting really badly injured and badly hurt as a result of the activities that were going on.
The horrors of the street battles prompted ordinary residents to start coming forward, and gradually information began to seep out. The police set up a special squad to investigate. It was called Operation Shampoo. It would reveal an international organisation of more than 2,000 soldiers with interests in illegal immigration, extortion, fraud, violence, heroin dealing, and armed robberies. Operation Shampoo was about to lift the lid off of organised crime in Southall.
In the early parts of the 20th century, London's East End was a patchwork of gangs. In Whitechapel, Iranians, Russian Jews who went from fighting the anti-Semitic violence to running protection rackets. To counter them, there were the Jewish vigilantes called the Odessians. The blind beggar gang was a team of pickpockets from Bethnal Green. Street thugs formed into groups and called themselves the Titanics, the Hoxton Mob, or the Vendetta Mob. There were the Jamaican Eddie Mannings and a Japanese outfit called Ses Miyakawa running drug rings. And then, down beside the river, controlling some of the busiest docks in the world, were the Watney Streeters.
Up until the late 40s, they were led by a man called Jimmy Fuller. And this was their manor, Watney Street in Wapping. I'm hoping that James can tell me something about the place.
James, here we are on Watney Street. Not quite how it would have been in the 20s.
No, in those days it would be back-to-back, no indoor lavatories, sort of shed in the back garden, certainly no baths, nothing like that.
Shows the posh
Shops, certainly, I mean, turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, it would have had 100 shops and probably 100 stores on a Sunday morning.
And strong Irish.
And a very strong Irish neighbourhood, and they all intermarried, they big Catholic community would intermarry, and it's always said you never knew who your cousin was because of the intermarriage in those days of the, so I say, turn of the century. And the Watney Streeters maintained presence, certainly, throughout the 1920s, for example. They were used by a man called Arthur Harding, or so he says, to break up part of the general strike.
How many people were in this gang?
I don't know, it's a very loose, amorphous thing. I don't think it's a gang. I think that they were, generally speaking, a fighting community, and if you needed them, they would rally round you. If they weren't fighting themselves, they'd come help out.
Yeah, they were obviously fighters to hire.
Big fighting gang, yes.
There were several gangs that the Streeters had to fend off. One of them was the Sabinis, a mafia outfit from Clerkenwell.
Certainly the story is that they one day ambushed the Sabinis, who came on a recce down here, I think, to deal with some bookmakers, and they found them, they walked into a trap. And what the Streeters allegedly, and this would be the middle 20s again, gave them a good hiding and sent them back to Clerkenwell.
The Streeters had been going for over a century. They made a tidy income. They'd got through the war when others had fallen. They'd survived the loss of their leader, Jimmy Fuller. But now there would be two forces which would bring about their demise. The first of these was out of their control. It was quite simply progress. The docks in Wapping suffered heavy bombing during the war. It wasn't worth rebuilding them. The ships were now getting much larger. They needed deeper water. Trade was moved downriver to Tilbury. By the 1950s, The London docks were closing. And this street was the heart of it. How did it change?
Ahí está. Buscando.
Once the docks started to...
Well, of course, you've got terrible deprivations in the war. I mean, you've got sort of Surrey docks, for example, in the war. One night, 380,000 tons of timber was destroyed. So you can think of the terrible deprivation that the East End suffered. After the war, there's a sort of regrouping, but by the 1960s, you're getting container ships, and the London docks can't cope with them. They haven't got the depth to cope with them. And so the docks move down to Tilbury. And consequently, the Watney Street is then, or the people on the docks start to lose their power.
The streeters began to diversify. They worked with the Jewish gangs in Aldgate, who run the clubs, the brothels, and the gambling joints. We provided protection for them. They'd always had a tough reputation, and they liked to fight. The Watney Streeters had always been enemies of Bethnal Green. They crossed the Sabinis a few times when they were in power there, but the Streeters had
Yeah,
always
so then he
managed
got
to deal with
fucked
them.
up and Peaky Blinders.
Now they faced a new threat, which would eventually lead to their
The
destruction.
craze,
The
man.
Krays.
Just like
What
I
other
said.
types of gangs were coming up through the 50s that were making their lives less easy?
I don't think they were making their lives less easy. I think, in fact, that the families were getting old. They'd made their money. Some were moving out. For example, George Cornell, who was killed by Ronnie Cray. He married a girl from South London, went over South London. It just sort of generally drifted away.
Right. And there was a sense that when the Krays came around, the Krays and the Watney Streeters were going to meet.
The Craigs and the Watney Streeters are always going to clash sooner or later, without any doubt.
By 1956, the twins were making serious money. They controlled an area from Bethnal Green east to Mile End, Stepney and Bow, and north to Hackney and Walthamstow. Within this area of 14 square miles, every gambling den, most of the pubs and many businesses, down to petty thieves, all paid their dues to the Krays. They were already known as the most dangerous mob in London. They would always be a threat to any surviving streeter. And it wasn't long before one of them, called Charlie, attracted their attention. Streeter Charlie would encounter the Krays on several occasions. He had a scam going with local post office drivers who would readdress parcels to places where he could collect them. Ronnie Cray, hearing the potential of the post office scam, demanded 50% of the profits. Charlie was not forthcoming with any money. He became listed by Ronnie as someone he would soon have to deal with severely. Ronnie's violent hatred towards anyone coming into his manor would lead him in the autumn of 1956 to use a gun and shoot someone for the first time.
One of the Watney Streeters, a friend of his, has a run-in with a garage who sold him a dud car, and he creates a bit of difficulty with the vendor of the car, putting it absolutely neutrally. Rodney won't have this, and he shot the man in the leg. He shot the doctor in the leg.
Was the garage was paying protection to the Krays at that point, I take it?
Yes, that would be the way of putting it. I think Rodney would always say it was a friend of his, but I have a
Right,
feeling
what else
that
could
money
you
was
do?
exchanged for the friendship.
And do you think Ronnie did
And
this
challenge
because
the
he wanted
authority
to
like that, the
show
Krays, the
other
London.
gangs of Watney
I think-
Streeters and his power?
Yes, but of course Rodney was completely out of control anyway, even back then. And whereas another person would have just given him a bad beating or perhaps a cutting, Rodney took it that one stage further.
But it was these moments in Ronnie's
These are
career
defining moments.
where he never had to be violent again. Once he fired those guns those first few years of his
Yes.
career, he could live off that.
That's right. And anyway, eventually, just to show his power, he has a whip round in the East End, and the docker is bought a pub or a share in a pub. And it shows that really sort of the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh.
It's a charity, it's not. But what happened? Did Ronnie
The
get
last given, the last taken.
Identification parade, and no one was picked out, surprisingly enough.
Because legend has it that Reggie turned up that day.
Reggie turned up and
Fuck
was
me.
going to say, if he was picked out, oh, I'm Reggie, and would foul up the identification parade anyway. It never came
Yeah,
with
man,
the
I've
things
got
was
to
in.
come off this in a few minutes. Yeah, just can't sleep. You know what I
To
mean?
the Watney Streeters, this was just a foretaste.
I was buried today.
The
I
craze
think
were a new
the
breed of
29th, is it today? The
unpredictable,
29th?
violent and ruthless.
Well, it's probably the
Their hunger
30th
for power
now,
knew
but
no
yeah.
bounds, and they were about to
He
unleash
dies on
violence
birthday,
of a type
I
never
forgot it.
before seen in the city.
This is why I'm compromised. And then we fucking 47, 48. You know,
In Southall at the end of the 80s,
yeah,
there was another gang flexing its muscles, the Tootie Nut.
but we'll push forward.
Oh, there you go.
They may not be so well known as the craze, but they soon became
Like shit
every bit
about the
powerful.
craze.
One man who had been on the receiving end of their threats was a Greenford shopkeeper called Miranda Palmer. Shortly after depositing his life savings of £20,000 into a local building society, two young Asian men walked into a shop, asked him to come outside for what they said was a business proposition. He was
That's what you
directed to
call
the
a
back seat of the
proper
car,
break,
and
man.
a gun was pointed to his head. One of them said, "We're the Tootie Nut. You know how important we are, and we want £20,000. It's a simple choice. You either pay us the money, or we kill you,
Obviously,
or
well,
we
I
feed you to our dog."
Dodson sounds good.
Miranda Palmer withdrew the £20,000 and handed it over.
Pay our debts, or you get fucked
Worried
up,
that the
man.
gang knew exactly how much he had in his
And
account,
I get it.
and terrified that they would return, he phoned the
But then
police.
on the end of that,
I'm meeting up with the man he spoke to, former Detective Superintendent Roy Herridge.
Tell me about Mahinda Palmer and his part.
Well, I understand that Mr. Palmer was being put under a number of threats in his shop, and it appeared to be protection. Now, I know my officers investigated that, and in the end, the case finished up at the Crown Court, where people were prosecuted and dealt with. That was one of the first people that came over and gave us information as to what was going on. And I think after we dealt with the individuals who were dealing with Palmer, then the public had confidence in the team that were investigating matters. And from that time onwards, a lot more information stemmed from that one inquiry.
The courage of Mr. Palmer going to the police opened a tiny crack in a vast criminal organisation. But this hadn't brought the Tootie Nut down, because the structure of the gang meant it was almost impossible to penetrate.
It's actually a very similar way to the way the terrorist cells work, and then you have an organisation, and you have these independent cells, and if you bust one of the cells, you haven't broken up the organisation at all, you've just taken out that one cell. And these gangs kind of started working from that model. So if the police did ever have any success and find a few gang members and find out what they were doing, and arrest them or put them away, the rest of the
can't
organisation was
sleep,
completely
man. You know what?
isolated,
How
and
do you
still carried on
forget the
independently.
date your dad's
By the
on
late
the birth?
1980s,
How do you do that?
police had shown that there was a hierarchy
I've
to
done
the
the
gang.
same with my
At
man.
its heart lay a group of powerful men. Up until now, they had remained untouchable.
I've just been so focused on all that stuff that,
Operation Shampoo set out to crack.
yeah, I forgot to put it in.
It would unearth one of the largest heroin smuggling operations ever discovered in Britain.
By the mid-50s, the craze had control of the East End. Now they wanted a slice of the action up west. But the
See,
Watney
so
Street
that, I'll
called
give
Charlie
up the
crossed
facts
before.
now.
jeopardised
That-
their plans.
That'd be an even bigger fight
In 1956,
than trying to
members of
come
the
off
Greys
there.
called Jones and
Give them
Ramsey
smoking.
took over a drinking club in Soho called the Stragglers Club.
See,
Jones and Ramsey
I
called
like
the
me,
twins to
I
handle
like
the
the smoke.
troublemakers. Reggie and Ronnie were delighted to form a partnership with them.
You know what I mean? You can get them in like different flavors.
But like a
You get
bad
them
penny,
red
the
flavor.
Watley Streeter Charlie would reappear. Jones got into an argument with him.
Like fucking,
Charlie beat him up severely.
they're expensive,
Now
that's
his
all.
business
So.
partner Ramsey, together with the Crow twins, would retaliate with a merciless attack. So, James, this is where the fight happened. The Britannia's now a perfect fried chicken place.
Absolutely. It's just, of course, by the Shadwell railway station. And this is where Richie, Ronnie, Billy Jones and Bobby Ramsey came looking for the Watley
Guys,
Streeters who
I'm
had
gonna
done
end
up
this
Ramsey.
live now. I'll be back tomorrow.
What happened was the Streeters got wind.
Yeah, I might be talking to a guy, an author tomorrow, interviewing him, talking a bit about his book, a bit about his story. From the same place as myself, Valley Farm, Scotland on Night, author, books published. He's fucking done a couple of fucker. Wanted me in one of them, but I had to back out. But I'm going to interview him for the crack. You know, I already need to know what I know. See, when you have nobody in the shop, that's when you know you have to change things up. So, good night, YouTube and streamers, and I shall be back tomorrow.
They then went looking for these cowardly Watley Streeters to give them a lesson.
Yeah, man.
I think Bobby
God
Ramsey
bless
runs a
us.
traffic light, and in those days you might find people, police on the street, and they'd pull there, and there's a blood stain.